Hi everyone, welcome to another Fuzzy Theory video. Today we will be exploring the figure of the Oriental monk in popular culture. The Oriental monk is a representation that fits a pattern of semiology. Semiology is the study of symbols and how they hold meaning for us. Semiology doesn't just mean visual symbols, but can include any kind of representation, including words. Understanding why red means stop and green means go would be an example of a semiological analysis. For today's video, we will be unpacking the semiology of the Oriental monk. The Oriental monk in popular culture is a trope or cliché that fits a pattern. The various versions of the Oriental monk blend together in popular imagination. These figures come together to form a homogenized kind of representation. This representation reproduces a pattern of images and expectations for the viewer or audience. In this video, we will unpack what the structure and function of the Oriental monk is. This video is predominantly based on the work of Jane Naomi Iwamura, an Asian studies scholar. Her chapter in the book Religion and Popular Culture in America is especially useful, though she also has a book that covers some of the same ground called Virtual Orientalism. In her work, she explores the history of this image in American popular culture and does a semiological analysis of how the Oriental monk functions. With these preliminaries out of the way, let's dig in. The Oriental monk isn't one figure, but rather a homogenization of Asian spiritual figures into a vague archetype for the Western imagination. The various figures of the Oriental monk can be real or fictive, or some blend therein. What to understand about this figure is that it signals Western imagination towards a set of expectations and tropes about what the Oriental monk means. The figure of the Oriental monk exists for the Western imagination to understand something in the symbolic order. It isn't really about each real example in the trope, but rather is a kind of idea independent from each example. Thus, the Oriental monk can range from the Dalai Lama to Yoda, from Gandhi to Kung Fu masters. The trope of the Oriental monk sets the Western imagination up to have a series of expectations about what the Oriental monk means, and there are expectations about how to understand, read, and parse this image for audiences. How does the semiology of the Oriental monk operate? What is the pattern that this figure reproduces? How do the various examples reflect a wider expectation? To answer these questions, we first have to understand that the Oriental monk operates by an Orientalist logic. For those who have never heard of Orientalism before, I will do a quick summary here, but I suggest you pause and check out my 3-minute theory video about Orientalism for a more detailed summary. Orientalism is a kind of colonial discourse that shapes the way the West understands the non-Western other, and in particular, Asia. Orientalism says that all of Asia is the same and holds qualities that are the opposite of the West. We can already see how Orientalism is thus problematic because, for example, Syria and Japan have very little in common. The homogenized Orient exists only in colonial imagination as a foil for Western identity. So, fundamental to Orientalism is the construction of a homogeneous East and the promotion of the binary between East and West. This binary serves to reassert Western identity over and above what it projects the Orient as. Further, this projection and self-identity have the semiological function of supporting colonialism. In the brute form of Orientalism, the Eastern other is constructed as savage and uncivilized to justify Western colonial intervention. We can see how Orientalist semiology maps onto the binaries in this chart. For the Oriental monk, however, rather than a brute Orientalism that says the non-Western other is uncivilized, we have a more subtle form of Orientalism that projects onto the Orient seemingly good qualities. In this formulation, the Orient is more spiritual, mysterious, and mystical, while the West is more materialistic, scientific, and rational. For the more spiritual-minded Westerner, this produces a desire for the spiritual East. However, this still places the West in hierarchical superiority, where the West is centered as the agent who will gain from the spirituality, while the other is reduced to a resource for appropriation or consumption. Note the irony that most of those Westerners who look East, because they imagine it is more spiritual, are already more spiritual-minded than the average person, Asian or otherwise. The figure of the Oriental monk is thus a stand-in for the fictive East of the colonial imagination, while the audience is positioned to either identify with or become the Western protagonist. If we look at the chart of Orientalist semiology again, we see at the bottom that part of the binary implies that the East is ahistorical, relegated to the past, its traditional knowledge a relic. It is only the dynamic, modern, active West that can properly make use of this knowledge for the present and future. Thus, a very Orientalist structure is implicated in the figure of the Oriental monk. The West, still superior, is the only one who can save Eastern wisdom, and is the agent who can make the best use of it. So the basic structure of the Oriental monk is to reproduce the structural superiority of the West in the colonial imagination, supported by Orientalist framings. Note that the Ancient One of recent Doctor Strange films still fits the Oriental monk structure, even if she isn't an Asian character. So now that we've mapped the basic semiological structure of the Oriental monk, we can then ask ourselves, what is the function of the Oriental monk? What is the continued repetition of this figure supposed to do? What's it for? In Iwamura's article, The Oriental Monk in American Popular Culture, we see that she uses some of the scholarly work that speaks to the representation of people of color in popular culture. There is a pattern of representation about people of color in American pop culture that they serve the function of what Xiaoling Ziwang calls ideological caregivers. Wang says that the, quote, ideological caregiver functions mainly as a resource, subject to appropriation to salve the insecurities of the master/mistress, end quote. Here we can think of Morgan Freeman's various characters helping the white protagonist to golf, or of the domestic figure who gives advice to the white protagonists on their own journey. This reproduces a semiological hierarchy that is called the, quote, psycho-spiritual plantation system, end quote. Iwamura calls this the spiritual caregiver, and we can see in the pattern of representation that is the Oriental monk that they function as the repository of knowledge or spiritual teaching that serves as a resource for the Western protagonist. This support functions as a handing of the torch from the passive East to the active West. Thus, one function of the Oriental monk's semiology is to signal the irrelevance of the East for the West. The Oriental monk is the last resource to be consumed by the West. So what on the surface looks like a beneficial exchange actually serves as a way to erase Asia as agentive and relevant in the collective imagination of Western imperialism. Further, the Oriental monk functions to reproduce the Orientalist binary in order to more subtly center the binary between the active West and the passive other. This centers the Western self as the one having the most value. Now, of course, in Western media, it is probably only natural to center Westerners. However, how this is done is within a semiology of colonial imagination that relegates the non-West into the dust heap of civilization. Implicitly, It implies that the West is justified in colonial intervention however it wants, because the other is made as an object for Western desire. All of this connects to another concept, often called the white savior complex. Often, representations of the Oriental monk are connected to the protagonist being a white savior. Here, we see the semiology of the white savior is the figure who must save the racialized other because they cannot save themselves. In relation to the figure of the Oriental monk, the white savior becomes the Western savior. So, Eddie Murphy in The Golden Child becomes the Western savior, though he is not white. The function of the ideology of Western saviorism, just like Orientalism, is not about any real Asia, but rather about repeating an image of the obsolete Oriental monk who needs to pass on the knowledge that the West can use for salvation. So here we have Karate Kid 2 having Daniel save Mr. Miyagi's home village. Neo in The Matrix is the chosen one and learns how to bend a spoon from an Oriental monk figure who sits in irrelevance in the Oracle's apartment. As Iwamura says, quote, "Here we find that the East also suffers despair and corruption and requires the help of the protagonists. Asia cannot save itself, but looks towards the powers of the newly enlightened Westerner. The bridge figure has come to signify salvation, not only for Western culture, but for the Orient as well," end quote. Thus, in the Doctor Strange comics, but also in the recent movie, the presence of the Ancient One functions as the bridge figure for Doctor Strange to become the hero. All of this positions the West in a place of moral justification and material necessity to take the resources of the spiritual caregiver and to then save the world or some small part of it. However, this maps onto the larger colonial imagination as a support for appropriating and commodifying the resources of the other for enlightened Western use, under the logic of, you're not using it anyway. Even for real figures like the Dalai Lama, the figure of the Oriental monk dramatically shapes how he is seen in Western imagination. As Iwamura says, the, quote, Tibetan variation of the Oriental monk enacts an exchange, a model of ethical behavior and spiritual direction for political and economic support. But this exchange serves the West well. America gains not only psychic resolution and healing, but also unchallenged economic and political patriarchal influence over the exiled nation, end quote. So, to summarize, the function of the image of the Oriental monk in popular culture reproduces notions of Orientalism, Western self-identity and supremacy, and the obsolescence of the non-Western other, and gives support for colonial intervention. While all of this is subtle, it is a fundamental part of the image. So, while the Oriental monk has caught our attention and produced much inspiration for Westerners, behind the image is a more subtle form of colonial and Orientalist semiology that feeds Western desire for control and domination. Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and comment.